Goeienaand aan al ons lesers. Namens Tafelberg Uitgewers en Graffiti, baie welkom by nog 'n Graffiti Aanlynkuier. Vanaand gesels ons met Dominique Malherbe en Joubert. Nou Dominique is die skrywer van die boek Op soek na Saartjie, Langenhoven se geheime liefde wat sopas verskyn het. En die boek is ook beskikbaar in Engels as Searching for Sarah. Nou, ek het die oomblik toe ek gehoor het van hierdie boek het ek geweet hier kom 'n ding. Hierdie boek gaan definitief baie goed verkoop. Nou Joubert is 'n skrywer, joernalis en 'n politieke kommentator en ek sien baie uit om meer van hierdie boek te hoor. Goeienaand Jan en Dominique.
Goeienaand. En baie goeie naand ook aan ons kykers. Baie dankie dat u ingeskakel het vir 'n ware speurtog in ons Afrikaanse letterkunde geskiedenis. Dis 'n dapper vrou wat saam met my hierdie uitsending waarneem en dis nie net vir jou nie wie julle ken nie, maar die ander dapper vrou is Dominique Malherbe. Sy is die een wat hierdie speurtog in ons land en ons volk se geskiedenis in onderneem het om vir ons meer te vertel van CJ Langenhoven, skrywer van die Stem, skrywer van Harry op die ou tramspoor, Sonde met die bure, Luluraai en elke liewe vorm van letterkunde in ons Afrikaanse letterkunde eintlik. En sy het gaan kyk na 'n aspek van sy lewe wat omstrede en interessant is. En sy moes nou vir jou grawe om by die waarheid uit te kom. Of in elk geval so naby as moontlik as wat mens kan. Oor die ware verhouding tussen CJ Langenhoven en 'n Joodse meisie, Sarah Goldblatt, wat vir hom beginne werk het en toe veel meer as 'n werker, 'n vriendin en in 'n sekere sin 'n lewensmaat geword het, soos wat hy Sarah Goldblatt se lewensmaat gebly het tot die dag van haar afsterwe in die 70er jare. Sy was die kurator van die letterkunde nalatenskap van Langenhoven en sy het Langenhoven absoluut op die hande gedra. Nou omdat almal van ons hier glo in soveel moedertaal gebruik as moontlik, gaan Dominique in haar moedertaal praat meerendeels wat Engels is, waarmee ek seker is nie een van ons 'n enkele probleem het nie, want ons gebruik almal graag ons moedertaal. Maar Dominique is daarom 'n Kaapse Engelse vrou en ons praat met julle hier uit Kaapstad in die Wes-Kaap vanaand en daarom praat sy ook die taal van die Kaap en dit is Afrikaans, so sy gaan hom tussenin gooi en Dominique baie welkom by hierdie bekendstelling, hierdie vreugdevolle dag, dat hierdie wonderlike werk van jou, wat ek werklik by almal aanbeveel, dan nou bekendgestel kan word.
Baie dankie Jan. Ek wou reeds so graag Afrikaans praat, maar ek is so skaam dat ek die verkeerde woordskap gaan gebruik. So ek gaan liewer in Engels praat en miskien as ek wil of as ek kan dan sal ek a few Afrikaans words I'll throw in, but thank you so much for having me and it's been such a pleasure to have met you actually Jan in this journey that we've traveled together a little bit in the story.
Ja, ek het 'n belangstelling in Langenhoven in elk geval as 'n leser en uit hoofde maar van my familie se belangstelling in en betrokkenheid by die wording van Afrikaans as 'n amptstaal en dan ook die gebruik daarvan, maar ook is ek lid van die Langenhoven Gedenkfonds en ons sien nou om na die nalatenskap van Langenhoven ook arbeidsgenot op Oudtshoorn, wat almal van u absoluut welkom is om te besoek. Arbeidsgenot word wonderlik in stand gehou, soos wat hy in die tyd van Langenhoven was. Maar Dominique, ek gaan die vrae in Afrikaans stel en dan antwoord jy hulle soos jy wil. En as iets vir jou onduidelik is, dan vra jy net vir my, ek het daarom in Natal groot geword, so ons kan Engels praat waar ek vandaan kom. Nou, so Dominique, vertel eerstens vir ons, wie was Saartjie Goldblatt? Almal weet wie was Langenhoven, maar hoe het Saartjie Goldblatt ingepas? Wat weet die algemene publiek wat wel weet van haar af?
Okay, ek sal nou probeer begin, maar miskien in Engels. Jan, she was a fascinating character. And what struck me about the story is that there was an inkling. Iemand het geweet, of baie mense het geweet 'n bietjie van Sarah, maar eintlik het hulle glad nie geweet nie wie die vrou was. En sy was 'n regtig interessante mens. Sy was hardwerkend, she was passionate about language, and of course she was totally in love with Langenhoven. So that's
and he really, with her.
And he with her, I think, yes, indeed, exactly.
En dit is wat ons gaan sien in hierdie boek gaan uitkom, is nie net dat hulle lief was vir mekaar nie, maar dat hulle ook minstens een kind saam gehad het. En dit het Dominique nagespoor, nie uit sensasiebelustigheid of wat ook al nie, maar om die feite te stel van 'n fout wat ingesluip het in die verstaan van 'n vrou, wat in 'n tyd geleef het, toe vroue nie altyd geag is nie, en hulle regte nie altyd gerespekteer is nie. So vertel asseblief vir ons, Dominique, wat is jou verwantskap aan Sarah Goldblatt?
Sarah was eintlik die suster van my oupa. So my oupa se naam was Israel. Ons het hom Alai genoem. We all knew him as Alai, so our family used to call him Alai. Maar sy was die suster van my oupa, my ma se pa. So Sarah was, yes, so that was the relationship that I had. So she was my great aunt. She was actually my great aunt, although strangely enough, I only met her once in my life. And I must have been about 10 years old, I think. No, probably, yes. No, sorry. She died when I was 10 years old. I met her once before in my life. So that was all because at the time she lived in the Cape and I lived in Johannesburg. And so there was not much contact actually with her. And so, of course, when she died in 1975, I was 9 years old.
En toe jy navorsing doen in die argief van die Universiteit Stellenbosch, toe kom jy af op jouself.
Yeah, that was a very strange experience, actually. You know, first of all, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to find. And, you know, the very first time that I walked into the library, you know, and I looked at the two librarians and I said, look, I don't know if you know this person, but I'm looking for somebody called Sarah Goldblatt. And of course, the two librarians looked at me like as if I was completely, you know, strange, and took me straight to the catalog. And of course, there it all was, right in front of me, the story waiting to be revealed and told. It was fascinating for me. So, yeah, so there were two photographs of myself and my sister at the Hartbeespoort Dam of iewers somewhere, yeah, and it was quite an emotional sort of finding all of this information there.
En 'n brief wat jy aan Saartjie geskryf het.
Yeah, yes, and a little letter thanking her for the 10 rand that she had sent my sister and I, and we hoped to spend it well.
Nou benewens die familieverbintenis, het jy gevoel daar is 'n rede hoekom Saartjie se verhaal vertel moet word? Dele wat uitgelaat is, dele waar sy nie tot haar reg gekom het nie. Waarom het jy gedrewe gevoel om hierdie verhaal ten boek te stel?
Ag ja, jy weet, ek het nou baie oor dit gedink. I think there were two reasons really that I thought it was important. I think from a personal point of view, from a family history point of view, because actually the family are as intrigued about the story. You know, none of the family have read it, obviously, other than my mother. And, you know, everyone, I think, you know, she was our family. And I think it's important from just a personal family story to understand who she was. But of course, the story is a much bigger story. It's a far greater story than that. And I felt that it was important that, you know, the country or the people are generally aware of the role that she played, not only in his life, in Langenhoven's life himself, but in the greater scheme of Afrikaans, and particularly at the moment when, you know, Stellenbosch University is going through this yellow crisis with Afrikaans, and I've never quite understood how they can just eradicate this language that is so fundamental to so many people. You know, bearing in mind that there's this obviously a lot of controversy about it, but it's very much part of our history, whether we like it or not. You know, not all parts of our history are fantastic, but this is an interesting part.
Ja, ek vind dit interessant, jy weet, hoe die werklikheid afhang van oogpunt, en is 'n goeie vraag of daar wel 'n vernietiging of eradication van Afrikaans in Stellenbosch aan die gang is. Ek dink wanneer al die feite opgeweeg word, mense moet maar mooi gaan lees wat daar aan die gang is en miskien kyk of dit waar is dat daar so 'n aanslag op Afrikaans is in Stellenbosch, maar dit daar gelaat. Wat ons wel te doen het mee is in die ontstaansstryd van Afrikaans, hierdie Joodse vrou wat so 'n groot rol gespeel het in Afrikaans en in die lewe van die man wat Afrikaanse mense leer lees het, CJ Langenhoven. Hoe sou jy sê, het die feit dat sy 'n vrou was en dat sy 'n Jood was, ingespeel op hierdie verhaal?
Oh gosh, Janjan, it's such an interesting question, because of course there are two themes here, really. The one is the theme of women, and women's stories and women's history and how they've really not been, in the limelight, and it's kind of their time to shine at the moment. It feels as if women have really come into their own in many ways. So that's the first layer. This is a woman's story and somebody who contributed, to history. But of course, the fact that she's Jewish is another aspect of all. And quite interestingly enough, I've almost wanted to start exploring that side of my heritage, which is a very interesting and obviously controversial aspect. Being a Jew in South Africa generally has never been without its problems. But ek is nou getroud met 'n Malherbe, so ek is nou heeltemal tweetalig. Ek is ook 'n boerejood eintlik. And I need to explore those sides, but of course that was complicated, particularly at the time, 1932, when there was, anti-Semitism, and of course anti-Semitism doesn't go away. But at the time, it was interesting that she was the one that was chosen to take care of his literary, his literary affairs. Yeah.
Absoluut. Jy verwys in die boek na my ou vriend professor Milton Shine hier van die Universiteit van Kaapstad se wonderlike boek 'n Perfect Storm. En vir enige van ons kykers wat belangstel in die geskiedenis van antisemitisme in Suid-Afrika, met ander woorde mense wat 'n haat het teen Jode en 'n afgryse het teen Jode, 'n tydperk wat 'n hoogtepunt bereik het in die 1920s tot 1940s, die presiese tyd van die verhouding tussen Goldblatt en Langenhoven. Die kan gaan kyk na sy boek 'n Perfect Storm, wat regtig 'n wonderlike boek is. Maar daar's ook 'n wonderlike boek oor Langenhoven, of so dink almal. En dit is John Kannemeyer, professor JC Kannemeyer van die Universiteit Stellenbosch se autentieke en magistrale baksteen van 'n boek, Langenhoven 'n lewe. Het jy die boek 'n hulp of 'n struikelblok gevind?
Janjan, this is a two-edged question, this one. I can tell you, in my discussions with Wilhelmine, with Wilhelmine Bremer.
Just stop a moment. Ek gaan net verduidelik wie's Wilhelmine en net hoe die familie aan mekaar steek. Jammer, Dominique, net vinnig. Langenhoven het een dogter gehad, Engela, wel amptelik. Ons sien nou daar was meer kinders, maar daarby kom ons net nou. Dogter Engela, en sy het een seun gehad, Gilou. En professor Gilou Bremer was baie jare lank hoogleraar in wiskunde aan die Universiteit van Kaapstad. Hy het 4 kinders, Nico, Corneels, Stefans en Wilhelmine. Corneels weet ek het 'n restaurant hierso in die suidelike voorstede van Kaapstad. Wilhelmine Bremer sal u ken as die verslaggewer van die Burger, wonderlike en veelbekroonde verslaggewer, en dan die ander seun Stefans, baie bekende ondersoekende joernalis by Amabungani, die mense wat staatskaping so oopgevlek het. So wanneer Dominique verwys na Wilhelmine, dan sit Wilhelmine Bremer 'n joernalis, die kleindogter van Langenhoven, althans agterkleindogter van Langenhoven, en die dogter van professor Gilou Bremer by wie ons gaan uitkom. Maar jy was besig om te praat oor Kannemeyer se boek en of dit jou gehelp of gehinder het.
Yeah, that was, when Wilhelmine and I first met, and of course I knew that I had to read Kannemeyer. I said to her, she said, you must start with Kannemeyer. So she said, even though you'll probably fall asleep, which is, I have to say that it is it's a huge fat book. If I could can I show it to you?
Yes, you might.
I'll show you my copy. Look at my copy here. It's sitting right next to me.
Hy's gedaan gelees, hè?
Kyk hierso. This is 'n groot boek en dit was al in Afrikaans. And I have to be honest, ek lees nie baie Afrikaans boeke nie. Well, up to now, I haven't been reading Afrikaans. So dit was vir my 'n regte labor of love to go through this book. En so op die een kant was dit 'n groot probleem dat die hele ding in Afrikaans was. As dit Engels was, sou dit so baie meer easier for me to have been. Okay, but that was the first thing. But obviously, Kannemeyer was the starting point of the story, because in fact, Sarah features predominantly or prominently in the story itself. So of course I had to start with Kannemeyer, and I had to understand what he said about Sarah. And he was, of course, the framework that I used for the book. So, you know, not only in the actual narrative, but his referencing, I used it extensively to understand what this whole thing was about. Yeah.
Maar jy het ook die boek steurend gevind. Daar was tekortkominge in die boek, daar's dele wat weggelaat is en jy het gevoel hoewel die eerste 4 hoofstukke van Langenhoven 'n lewe net oor Saartjie Goldblatt gaan, voor hy nog by Langenhoven se geboorte kom, het jy gevoel dat hy haar nie korrek weergegee het nie en dat hy haar eintlik 'n oneer aangedoen het, of hoe?
Ja, nee, dat was waar. And that was the intriguing part of the story. I kind of, you know, it was an impression that I formed early on in my reading of Kannemeyer, is dat hy het nie van haar gehou nie. Dit was seker vir my. En ek het nou besluit, maar hoekom? Wat het sy nou eintlik gedoen om die man so te irriteer? Dat hy so, you know, so ugly. He didn't speak well of her. There were very, very few times that he kind of acknowledged her role in his life at all. And that was the tone that I had to deal with. And of course, you know, he is this extraordinary biographer. He's, you know, well known in the country and well known in his works. And I was nervous to kind of take on his legacy. That was very much a part of the book that I had to kind of come to terms with. You know, I didn't want to cause a controversy actually in this whole story. But of course I had to deal with Kannemeyer. He was my first obstacle. And of course then my help as well.
Nou, as 'n nie-Afrikaans sprekende persoon wat nou ingekyk het op die Afrikaanse leefwêreld en die Afrikaanse leeswêreld, hoekom was dit vir jou belangrik om hierdie boek ook in Afrikaans te publiseer? Jou boek, jou eie boek, hierdie opsoek na Saartjie.
You know, in discussion with publishers, right? In fact, you know, before this publisher, I was in conversation met nog 'n publisher, en hulle het gesê, jy weet, jy moet die boek skryf. Dit is baie belangrike storie, maar jy moet in Afrikaans skryf. En ek het gesê, nee, ek kan dit nooit doen nie. I can hardly read the Afrikaans. That was already difficult for me. There was no ways I could have written in Afrikaans. So it was an absolute blessing for me when Tafelberg said, you know, well, once we'd agreed that we would do it in both languages, because obviously I think the readership, I think, is predominantly Afrikaans readership, but I think that the whole Jewish aspect and of course the story itself lends itself to a much wider readership than Afrikaans. So for me it was an absolute blessing that I had the opportunity of writing in English and then still producing it in Afrikaans.
En is so gepas, want Saartjie Goldblatt het heel vir Afrikaans in haar lewe. Sy was trouwens 'n lidmaat van die NG Kerk, en wel die NG Kerk Kaapstad, en dit is die groot kerkgemeente. En jy vertel 'n pragtige storie oor tant Saartjie en wat 'n slag gebeur het toe self van gevorderde jare was. Sy was al oor die 80. Toe gebeur 'n ding met haar op die trappe van die NG Kerk. Vertel ons so 'n bietjie.
It's one of those personal stories that my mother had an input in as well, of course. You know, my mother's been so excited about this book because, of course, it was her aunt. It was her father's sister. And she's never understood the story, and she feels so sad that she never asked. She never asked what happened to Sarah at the time when she was still alive. And that's the thing about, you know, one of the sadnesses about families and histories is that you don't ask enough questions. So in between all this heavy research and Alice, she told me some sort of personal anecdotes. And the one is that she can't recall the exact time, but she was with Sarah because, of course, she was studying at UCT and Sarah was here, and she was obliged to go and visit Sarah at certain times. You know, it was the strict, you must go and see your aunt, you know, wanneer jy studeer, go and pop in with your aunt, which of course she didn't really enjoy. And they were going down, she just recalls vaguely walking down the steps at the NG Kerk or wherever in Adderley Street, and Sarah's heel got caught on the stairs and she slipped, and in so doing she grabbed the arm of some strange gentleman next to her and literally hung onto him as she fell down the stairs. When she got to the bottom, she stayed upright, but when she got to the bottom, she literally just, tipped her hat. She always wore these funny twin sets and a matching hat. And she literally just said, "Dankie meneer," and off she went, It was kind
Ek
of
word
her
baie
manner.
streng, so 'n pikkie wyntjie. Aanstap sy.
Ja, presies.
En dit som maar nogal op en dis hoekom ek so dankbaar is, Dominique, vir jou en vir Tafelberg dat julle wel die boek in Afrikaans ook uitgee en ek wil tog op ons kykers die beroep doen om inderdaad hierdie gebaar te ondersteun en hierdie heerlike boek wat ek nou weer gisteraand deurgelees het, tog aan te skaf ook. Maar in Kannemeyer se standaardwerk oor Langenhoven maak hy geen verwysing na 'n potensiële liefdesverhouding met Sarah Goldblatt nie, dan Saartjie soos sy in die Afrikaanse leefwêreld bekend was. Maar toe het daar 'n storie ontstaan wat in die Brummer familie, wie ek net nou uiteengesit het, loop en wat Jerome Brummer aan jou bevestig het en ook Wilhelmine Brummer, en dit is dat Engela 'n slag op Saartjie en Langenhoven afgekom het in die kombuis. Nou wat's daai storie?
Jan, no, actually, you're a little bit incorrect there in a sense, because in fact, Kannemeyer does refer to it. He does refer to it, but in nagesprek. And in fact, Wilhelmine and I chatted about that, and I said, yes, he does refer to some kind of liaison, but never quite really giving it the weight that it was afforded. He kind of dismissed it. So in fact, Kannemeyer writes about it. He writes about that incident because he actually obviously interviewed Guillaume when he was writing the book, and Guillaume told him the story, which he's in fact mentioned in his biography, in his biography of Langenhoven. But then further on, he kind of dismisses it, strangely enough. He'll say, from time to time there would have been 'n liggaamlike omgang tussen hulle plaasgevind. When Langenhoven came to Parliament, but then he always went back to Vroukie in Oudtshoorn.
So ek bedoel, to his credit or discredit.
Yes, exactly.
Maar wat het dan nou gebeur? Waarop het Engela in die kombuis afgekom?
Engela het hulle, so as far as the story goes, hulle in a compromising position gesien. But she also heard them talking. She had heard them talking, and she confronted her mother, and she said, "Why do you tolerate this?" In fact, that is in Kannemeyer. Kannemeyer actually writes it. Is that she confronts her mother, Engela, and says, "Why, Vroukie, says, why do you tolerate it?" And she said, "Because I love him." So there's a real interesting a relationship issue and about women of that time as well. And one's also got to bear in mind who Vroukie was. She was 10 years older than Langenhoven. She was widowed. She had 4 children of her own. So she'd had a life. She'd had a life before Langenhoven. And so one's priorities and relationship with somebody was very different to the one that perhaps a much younger woman might have had. So she almost accepted the fact that he may have well had extramarital affairs, and that was good. That was fine for her.
Goed. Ons gaan nie in hierdie gesprek te wild stil staan by die hele kwessie van die kind of die kinders wat hulle saam gehad het nie, want dit is in 'n sekere sin die kern van die boek, en ons wil graag hê u as die kyker moet die boek aanskaf, so ons moet dit vir u laat om te doen. Maar voordat u dink dat dit net uit die lug gegryp is, gaan ek aanhaal uit 'n gedig wat Langenhoven geskryf het in 1927, wat nie algemeen baie wyd bekend is nie, maar hier is 'n strofe daaruit. Dit sê, en hou nou in gedagte of dit moontlik kan verwys na sy eersgebore seun by sy Joodse minnares. Dit sê, die laaste maal en vir die laaste maal het ek hom op die naam geroep, my naam vir hom, die naam van net ons twee alleen. Nou ja, wat maak jy van daai gedig? Dit is 'n veel langer gedig, maar ek het nou net die kern strofe uitgehaal.
this was, of course, the real kernel of the story for me in many ways. It's something, well, first of all, I must just go back a step. This poem, Sarah was the subject of a master's thesis, in which some of her story was also came out. And this poem was there, and when I read the poem, and I don't want to go too much off the topic, but when I read the poem and I got hold of Leonie van Zyl, who was the person who'd written the thesis on Sarah, I wanted to know from somebody who had really spent time with her what she thought of the poem as well. Because in my mind, the poem clearly meant that van ons twee alleen was not something that Kannemeyer referred to. Kannemeyer referred to that poem and said, nee, dit was die naam van hulle. Sy was die sub en hy was die chief. And those were names that everyone knew about. So that certainly couldn't have related to them, die naam van ons twee alleen. So what was he referring to, Langenhoven, in that poem? Was it somebody else that would only have been known to the two of them? So when I actually contacted Leonie right at the beginning, and I said, what do you make of that poem? Do you think that it's referring to the two of them? And she said, no, it's far more intimate than that. It's far more intimate than that. So, you know, I was pleased that I had somebody else look at it sort of objectively, because of course she doesn't have the same interest in the story as I do, and verify that no, there was something else to this poem. It couldn't have been the two of them.
Nou, dit is my baie duidelik, veral ook omdat ons hier te doen het met die gebruik van die manlike enkelvoud voornaamwoord. Met ander woorde, hy skryf hierso vir hom die naam van ons twee alleen. Nou, wat Dominique na verwys met sub en chief, toe Sarah Goldblatt in Langenhoven se lewe gekom het, was sy die subredakteur, dis die mens by 'n koerant wat die berigte pers klaar maak, al die spelfoute regmaak ensovoort, en hulle het by die destydse koerant het Suidwesten in Oudtshoorn saamgewerk vir so 2,5 jaar. So sy was die sub, hy was die redakteur, so het mekaar altyd sub en chief genoem. So ek stem saam met jou en met Leonie van Zyl dat dit verseker nie daarna kan verwys nie, verseker nie. Nou dink jy dat daar wel 'n kind verwek is tussen Langenhoven en Sarah Goldblatt?
Oh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, you know, for me, and of course, our family knew that there was a child. But that's all they could tell you. And that was the frustration with the story, is that when I asked them, I kept saying to them, but you must have known. And all I got was, well, we just knew. We just knew that there was a child. And that's the extent to the extent to which I had to try and find the story myself.
En ek dink nie ons gaan nou in die detail daarop ingaan nie, want soos sy sê, daai pragtige Engelse woord kernel, die naaste wat ons het daaraan in Afrikaans is die kern van die verhaal, gaan in 'n groot mate daarom. Hoekom? Want dit is die verpersoonliking en die wese van die feit dat daar wel 'n verhouding tussen Langenhoven en Saartjie was, dat daai verhouding ontken is, deels om genderredes, deels om, want die geslagsrolle was anders, deels om miskien nasionalistiese en volksredes met die antisemitisme en die feit dat sy nie Afrikaner was nie, al wou sy so graag wees. So Dominique, ek gaan nou vir jou vra om nie te veel uit te brei op die detail van al die navorsing wat jy gedoen, wat jy gevind en nie gevind het nie, want dis die boek. Maar wat sê die Brummers? Is daar in die Langenhoven familie, en ons sê weer, die Brummers is die enigste afstammelinge van Langenhoven, wat sê hulle? Was daar 'n kind?
Ja. Hulle het vir my ook verduidelik dat daar 'n kind was. And unfortunately it's the same story, is that I couldn't get very much more detail on waar die kind was, of wie die kind is, of waar hy gelewe het, of hoe, you know, if one had to work out, we've only got certain dates. We've only got a very small, little bit of information to work from. So yes, I mean, they will collaborate with the story, absolutely. But the detail is difficult to find.
Nou, jy vind nogal baie van daai detail. En ons gaan so 'n bietjie afstap daarvan af en sê kom ons aanvaar dit is so. En kom ons aanvaar dat die familie aan albei kante, het sy die Goldblatts of die Langenhoven Brummers, die het geweet van die kind. Hoe het dit die invloed tussen Saartjie en vroutjie, dis Langenhoven se eggenote, Maria Hugo, hoe het dit hulle verhouding beïnvloed? Wat was die verhouding tussen hulle?
Dit was vir my so 'n interessante verhouding, Jan, want if you look at Kannemeyer, he will describe it in a very different way to the way in which I found it. And for me, it seemed very much like almost a mother-daughter relationship between Vroutjie and Saartjie. Because, of course, she was a much older woman. And they were actually very good friends. And if you look at the letters, she speaks to her as if she was a mother. She talks to her.
What's her name for her?
Sy noem vir haar ons kind. En ons is sub. Sy beskryf haar in dieselfde woorde wat Langenhoven vir haar beskryf het. My sub.
Hoe verwys Saartjie na vroutjie?
Mamsie, reg. Ja, reg so, ja. Mamsie. So dit was vir my so interessant dat hierdie vrou mense actually had quite a nice relationship. They were actually good friends. And in fact, she relied on Sarah so much in looking after Langenhoven. You know, he was an interessante karakter, daai ouetjie. You know, he was truly an interesting character. I find him fascinating, and I think it's actually, I'm so excited about this because I feel like I need to go and start and learn all about Langenhoven all again because I've never read his stories. You know, they were not things that I took note of at the time.
Ek sou so nou dink, ja, dis waarskynlik die beste skrywer of een van die beste skrywers wat die land, in elk geval die mees uiteenlopende skrywer wat die land ooit uitgeval. Alles van wetenskapfiksie tot taalkunde tot tot wat hy genoem het snipes, met ander woorde sulke lekker vertellinge tot poësie van wisselende aard en standaard. Maar ja, nee, ek stem saam, wonderlike mens, maar oopkop, nee, en dis wat jy sê oor sy vrou. Dit was oopkop mense wat miskien nie ingebind is deur die sosiale inbinding van die tyd nie.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, you know, and there's obviously a whole nother side to him that people don't necessarily talk about, but that's the age that we're in at the moment, is that people are talking about these things now. You know, people are telling stories that were not previously told. And daar's baie geheime in ons geskiedenis.
Absoluut, en ons moet vir hulle naspeur en met vreugde, nie met naaiwer nie, vind, want dit is die totaliteit van die mens. Nou, dieselfde geld Engela, wat duidelike 'n gekonflikteerde verhouding gehad het met Sarah Goldblatt, in die sin dat partykeer was sy geïrriteerd met haar, maar uit die briewe blyk ook 'n innigheid, of lees ek dit verkeerd?
Nee, glad nie. You know, one can imagine, if one can try and imagine the relationship that she had with her. First of all, Sarah is the mistress of her father. That's the first thing one's got to think about. She's the mistress of her father, but she also looks after Engela, and she's quite close to Engela. She's fond of Engela because remember, Sarah doesn't have children of her own. Well, supposedly. So she really wanted to immerse herself in this family of Langenhoven. And she looked after Engela almost as if she was a daughter. You know, Engela would ask her advice on what she should do with her hair, and she sent her. You know, the correspondence was you know, quite interesting in terms of what it revealed between the two of them. And then, of course, Engela had her own issues, sadly, towards the end of her life. And I think it was only then that she appreciated the work that Sarah did for her father. So I think there were complications all round.
Ja, jy kry dieselfde gecompliseerde verhouding tussen Guillaume Brummer en Saartjie, waar Guillaume, dit weet ek, geweldig geïrriteerd was met die feit dat Saartjie so doenig was rondom Langenhoven, maar terselfdertyd is daar net een peetma vir die 4 Brummer kinders, vir Guillaume se 4 kinders en Letitia Brummer se 4 kinders, het net een peetma gehad en dit was
Saartjie. Ja, dit was vir my so verrassing, want and they told me themselves, you know, the Brummer family said that not only was she Engela's godmother, Guillaume's godmother.
Yes.
She was Guillaume's godmother, but she was also the godmother to the 4 Brummer children.
Ja, so dit moet 'n hegtheid tog veronderstel, né? Nee?
Ja, reg, ja.
So elke familie is seker maar gekompliseerd, maar toe kom Saartjie se laaste dae en dit was na daardie enorme eeufees herdenkingsjaar wat van ons kykers van meer gevorderde jare definitief sal onthou, 1973 met die Harry op die ou tramspoor, die olifant wat daar van Oudtshoorn af geloop het ensovoort, die gedenkjaar. En toe het Saartjie, toe was dit haar blus uit is. En haar laaste dae was baie hartseer. En die is vir ons redelik goed opgeteken deur 'n wonderlike bron wat ek net nogmaals sê, nie familie is van my nie. Elsa Joubert, wonderlike skrywer wat ons verloor het verlede jaar aan COVID op die ouderdom van 97. Maar sy was baie goeie vriende met Saartjie Goldblatt gewees en sy vertel vir ons van Saartjie se laaste dae. Vertel bietjie jy vir ons, Dominique, wat skryf Elsa?
Oh, that was a really sad part for me, that story. Elsa Joubert was one of the first people that I interviewed, actually, for this story. She was the only person of the friends of Sarah that was still alive. And of course, she had her own, you know, she was obviously, yes, at the time, 90-something, she was in the process of writing Sperrtyd. It was actually a lovely meeting. I met her and she was quite excited. She showed me the papers of Sperrtyd that was about to be published. And I found her a fascinating woman. She looked well, she was bright, and I was fascinated by her. But the story she tells of Sarah's last few days was very sad because Sarah had no one else around her. You know, there's the speculation that the only person that was with her was, now I've completely forgotten her name. Anyway, her helper, her nurse. Johanna, yeah, reg. And apart from Johanna, there was no one else, and she'd come to the end of her life and she didn't really know where she fitted in. You know, she was neither Afrikaans by birth. She was rejected from the Jewish community because she was never really accepted as part of the Jewish community. She didn't consider herself English. She considered herself Afrikaans in hart en siel en gees, and that was who she was. But sadly, she was never recognized by them as an Afrikaner, and I think that must have caused enormous heartache for her. So it was a very sad part of that for me. Yeah.
En toe het sy daar in haar laaste dae het Elsa Joubert en Audrey Blinow, met wie sy ook bevriend was, die groot essayis van die Afrikaanse taal, het haar gaan besoek en hulle het daar 'n patetiese stukkie mens gevind wat na haar moeder geroep het.
Yeah. I mean that you know, there's another whole angle to it. There is that one doesn't really understand the relationship that Sarah had with her own mother, but it was certainly not nearly as close as the one that she had with either Engela or with Vroutjie for that matter. So, well, certainly from the correspondence. So it's you know, there's a gap there. There's a whole missing element there of you know what that relationship was like, and sadly the family can't tell us what that relationship was like either. So, I mean, it's fascinating for me that you know what that relationship with her own mother would have been like.
Nou jy het besluit aan die begin van hierdie proses om te gaan soek na Saartjie. Het jy haar gevind? En hoe was sy?
Oh, I think I found a part of her. I think I found quite a substantial part of her. Ek het vir haar gevind. But I don't know if one ever really understands the inner mind of a person. And sadly, one's really got to, delve deep into personal documents and journal entries and things to understand the mind. And so I'm so pleased that I found some of those personal documents, because those are the things, when a person is no longer here, those are the things that, you really have to rely on in order to understand who she was. Yeah.
Ek dink ek sal nou sê, maar ek dink jy doen jouself 'n onreg aan. Ek wil regtig vir ons kykers sê, ek dink Dominique het die dame deurgrond en vir ons so bevatlik en moontlik gemaak om te verstaan. 'n wonderlike boek hierdie. Ek het hom weer gisteraand gelees, dis nou die 4de keer. En ja, wel jy weet, ek meen Dominique en ek het mekaar ontmoet deur die loop van hierdie proses en ek het 'n belang in die boek ontwikkel en Dominique was so goed om vir my deur die wording van die boek dit te laat saam beleef, maar die uiteindelike proses, dit lees so lekker, is so fascinerend. Dit vertel jou soveel van mense, van verhoudinge, van vroue, van families, van Afrikaans en van die Joodse gemeenskap van ons land, waarvan baie van ons wat Afrikaans sprekend is, eintlik maar 'n beperkte kennis het. Nou, wat was vir jou die lekkerste en die moeilikste daarvan om die boek te skryf?
Die lekkerste was sommer in die Stellenbosch biblioteek, die bib. Hulle noem dit die bib, toe gaan sit. Ek het so daarvan gehou, want my dogter is ook nou besig daar om te studeer. En ek het saam met haar koffie gaan drink, terwyl ek nou, uitgekom het. And I love that research. I could sit in a library for days. I love that. So dit was die lekkerste. Die moeilikste was vir die Afrikaans vir my eintlik, sou ek sê. Om alles in Afrikaans te lees, was moeilik vir my. En dit het langer gevat, wat, as ek wou, as I wanted. It would have been a lot easier for me if this thing was all in English. Then, of course, we had to translate it into Afrikaans. So we had to go back na die oorspronklike dokumente om te sien whether I got it all right, whether the Afrikaans, want it was nie dieselfde, it wasn't spelled the same way, and, we had to check and see, did I get it right, and was I correct? So ja, dit was miskien die moeilikste.
Dit is interessant, want kyk, daai was die tydperk, hulle was in 'n professionele vriendskaps- en liefdesverhouding tussen 1912 en 1932 en almal van ons wat die geskiedenis van Afrikaans ken, die sal weet dat die spelreëls vir Afrikaans het nie eens bestaan aan die begin van daai tyd nie. Dis hoekom die Suid-Afrikaanse Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kuns die Afrikaanse woordelys en spelreëls begin navors het in 1909 en hulle was nog nie klaar in 1912 nie. So in 1912 was toe hulle begin het, dan loop dit deur daai hele tydperk, die stigting van die burger, die koerant wat dan nou beginne om Afrikaans op skrif neer te sit, 1925 deur die bemiddeling van Langenhoven, die erkenning van Afrikaans as amptelike en amptstaal. So mens kan wel verstaan dat daar 'n klomp amper terugnavorsing moes wees nadat Dominique het geskryf het, moet hulle nou weer gaan kyk of dit nou reg gedoen is van die begin af. Maar nadat ons nou deur al hierdie goed is, en ek dink julle het dit wonderlik gedoen. En ek wil net vinnig met jou saamstem oor die Universiteit Stellenbosch biblioteek. Dit is 'n fenominale skatkis van inligting. Ek staan besig met my meestersgraad oor iets heel anders en ek werk in daai argiewe van daai biblioteek. Daardie personeel, ek weet jy het hulle partykeer 'n bietjie afwysend gevind, maar miskien is mense wat met boeke werk, Leo nie uitgesluit, nie altyd die grootste kommunikeerders nie, hulle is groot lesers, maar ek vind daai mense so vaardig en so toeganklik en daardie plek is so wonderlik in stand gehou dat ek net wens mense wil ophou om die universiteit aan te val oor allerlei ander dinge en eerder begin waardeer wat hulle gaan verloor as hulle aanhou met die aanval. Is 'n wonderlike plek. Hoe sou jy wou hê Dominique moet Saartjie onthou word?
Ek wil hê dat Saartjie onthou word dat for all the work that she did and her contribution that she made to Afrikaans. I don't want her to be remembered, I think that the impression that Kaname leaves about Sarah is not a very favorable one. And I suppose that part of the hope in writing this book is to dispel that perception or whatever, to just understand that really it was her passion that drove her, and that she did an enormous amount for Afrikaans. And, in terms of not, in keeping Afrikaans alive, she really did play an enormous part from all sides, not only from the teaching profession, the pre-teaching profession and the radio talks and the private tuition at home, of course, the STEM and alles, but just in creating that culture, and of course, arbeidsgenot. I need to go back and have a look and see what's all there. But it was just her perpetuation, really, of Afrikaans as a rich and rewarding language, and I'd like her to be remembered for the contribution that she made in Afrikaans, irrespective of Langenhoven, really.
Nou kyk, ek dink daarin het jy wonderlik geslaag, en vir ons wat hier kyk en lief is vir die taal en belangstel in sy wordingsgeskiedenis, ek wil tog vir ons kykers sê, gaan kry die boek. Dit is absoluut die moeite werd, dit is 'n speurtog, en soos julle nou met Dominique sien, sy is 'n ontsettend intelligente persoon, en waar intelligente mense soms dit tekort het aan teenoor miskien ander mense, is dat intelligente mense kan van hulle self nie te seker wees nie. Saam met intelligensie kom twyfel. So Dominique het haarself nou hierso 'n bietjie tekort vertel. Ek is nou nie so slim soos sy nie, so ek het meer sekerheid daaroor. En dit is dat hierdie 'n wonderlike boek is. En ek wil hê jy moet asseblief daarna gaan kyk. Ek wil ook hê, en as ek mag namens die Langenhoven Gedenkfonds sê, dat en onder ons besielende leier Erika Barnard vir u nooi om arbeidsgenot te besoek. Dis in Van Riebeekstraat in Oudtshoorn. Dis wonderlik in stand gehou. Jy stap in Langenhoven se lewe in, dis soos wat dit was. Gaan gerus, dis 'n wonderlike plek. Maar Dominique, dankie dat jy met ons gepraat het vandag. Dankie vir hierdie wonderlike werk wat jy vir ons taal en ons mense gedoen het, en vir begrip van die rol van die vrou, die rol van die Joodse gemeenskap, en miskien bo alles, dat die liefde in die woorde van ID Du Plessis 1000 forme aanneem. Baie dankie dat jy ons ingelaat het op die pragtige liefde tussen Langenhoven en Sarah Goldblatt.
Baie dankie, Jan. It was really for me an absolute privilege to have met all of you through this journey, and to have explored another whole side of culture that I could never ever have understood had I not really decided to embark on this search. So I'm completely delighted. I feel completely enriched by the whole experience, of going to go and look for Sarah. So thank you, and thank you for agreeing to be in the interview and whatever. It was lovely, really lovely to meet you.
Lekker.
Baie dankie Jan en Dominique. Dominique, ek wil ook net beamoen wat Jan sê, baie dankie vir hierdie boek wat jy tot ons skatte toegevoeg het. Ek dink dit is 'n boek wat elkeen van ons moet lees, ons Afrikaanse mense en die Engelse mense, want dit is after all in Engels geskryf. Koop die boek gerus by Graffiti boeke, en baie dankie dat julle saam gekuier het. Ek het 'n groot waardering vir mense wat hierdie tipe boeke skryf en wat ons so bewus maak van die wonderlike skatte daar buite. Baie dankie.
Baie dankie, Janie.
Dankie vir die lekker. Dankie vir die saamkuier, en ons sien mekaar binnekort weer. Goeienaand.